Two innocent twins vanished without a trace while playing hide and seek, only for a hidden diary to surface a decade later, unlocking secrets that would shatter a small town and reveal a courageous fight for survival. This is a story of mystery, loss, and hope you won't want to miss. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from by dropping a comment below. I'm excited to hear from you. Now, let's dive into the story. It was the kind of summer evening that lingered in memory. Soft air, scented with pine and wildflowers, the sun a golden coin sinking behind the New Hampshire hills. The Davis family had gathered as they often did in July, escaping the noise of the city to spend time at Rachel's parents' farmhouse just outside the sleepy town of Grayson Hollow. The house, built in the late 1800s, sat on a gentle rise surrounded by fields, a barn with flaking red paint, and a forest so thick it swallowed sound. It was here, between the back porch and the tree-line, that the twins disappeared. Emma and Eli were 8 that summer, lively and inseparable, as close as a single breath drawn in 2 lungs. They had a game they loved, hide and seek, played in the golden hour, always with a set of homemade rules that only they seemed to understand. That evening, after helping Grandpa stack firewood and snatching 2 fresh lemonade cookies from Grandma's cooling rack, they darted off toward the woods, calling out to each other with laughter so light it seemed to drift like smoke through the trees. Rachel remembered calling out to them, just once, reminding them not to go too deep. Mark, their father, was setting up the fire pit and gave a half-hearted, "You've got 20 minutes, Em." Then the screen door slapped shut, and all anyone heard after that was the chorus of crickets and the gentle rustling of birch leaves in the breeze. 20 minutes passed, then 30. At first, it didn't feel like panic. It was concern, the kind every parent brushes aside with a deep breath and a "they'll come out when they're hungry." But hunger came, and still the woods remained silent. When Rachel called for them again, sharp this time, her voice rising above the insects, it echoed back unanswered. The search began just before twilight. Flashlights were pulled from drawers. Voices grew louder. The initial circle grew, first the backyard, then the wood's edge, then a full sweep of the property. By nightfall, Mark was already calling neighbors, Rachel pacing barefoot in the grass, whispering the twins' names like a prayer she could no longer remember the words to. By midnight, the sheriff had arrived. Deputy cars parked askew in the gravel driveway. Dogs were brought in, then helicopters by dawn. Volunteers flooded the fields, forming lines with arms outstretched, combing through every square foot of woods behind the house. They searched creeks, overturned logs, checked every hollow tree and hunter's blind within 5 miles. The FBI sent agents. News vans circled like vultures. The twins' faces, sun-kissed, smiling, freckles scattered like stars across their cheeks, were suddenly everywhere. But no matter how wide the net, nothing turned up. No footprints, no torn fabric, no disturbed soil, just silence, deeper than any the town had ever known. People talked. They always do. Some whispered that the forest was cursed, that the old stories about the land were true. Stories of people wandering in and never coming out. Others blamed the parents. Some thought the twins had run away, that maybe they'd gotten lost and met with a wild animal or a fall too steep to survive. But those who knew the Davis family, truly knew them, understood something more chilling. Emma and Eli were never the type to wander far. They knew those woods like their own backyard. If something had happened, it hadn't been by chance. As the days bled into weeks, hope thinned like the morning fog. The official search was called off after 2 months, though Rachel and Mark never truly stopped. Mark sank into himself, taking long drives at night, leaving with maps and returning with scraped hands and hollow eyes. Rachel stayed close to the woods, returning every week, sometimes daily, laying out little gifts, Emma's favorite doll, Eli's red race car, photos, drawings. She spoke to the trees as if they were old friends who might one day decide to talk back. Autumn came, then winter. Birthdays passed in silence. The twins' room remained untouched, their shoes still lined up by the door, toothbrushes still in the holder. Grief took root in the corners of the house like mold, silent and unrelenting. Eventually, Mark left, not just the house but the marriage. He moved 2 towns over and stopped returning Rachel's calls. Some losses are too sharp for two people to carry together. The case went cold. The files were boxed and shelved, the headlines faded, and the world, as it always does, moved on. But in Grayson Hollow, time didn't move quite the same. There, the woods still held a quiet unease. Children no longer played past sundown. Parents didn't let their kids out of sight. And Rachel Davis, now alone, kept her eyes on the tree-line every time the wind rustled the branches. She told herself that one day, something would surface. A clue, a sound, a sign, anything. Because children don't just vanish. Not without a trace. Not two of them. Not like that. 10 years can pass like a breath or like a slow, crushing weight, depending on how one carries their grief. For Rachel Davis, the decade following her children's disappearance hung on her like a second skin. Heavy, suffocating, inescapable. The farmhouse remained much the same on the outside. White paint peeling, wind chimes still hanging from the porch, the woods just as quiet. But inside, time had carved hollows into the walls and into Rachel's face. She had become a woman of solitude, thinner, quieter, with eyes that watched everything yet saw only what was missing. Mark Davis had left 2 years after the twins vanished. He had stayed longer than many expected, but guilt and helplessness slowly turned him into someone Rachel could no longer recognize. He stopped shaving. He drank in the evenings, always in silence, always with a look that said he was searching for something far beyond the walls of their home. Their arguments weren't loud, but they were final. Would he pack his things into the back of his old truck and pulled out of the gravel driveway? He didn't say goodbye. He moved 3 towns away and took a job as a groundskeeper at a rural cemetery. Something about the quiet and routine of death being easier to manage than the chaos of life. They spoke once or twice a year after that. Rachel would call on the twins' birthday or the anniversary of the disappearance, and Mark would answer, his voice slow and strained. Neither of them ever had anything new to say, but the calls were less about words and more about bearing witness to the ache neither could outrun. Rachel stayed behind. The house had belonged to her parents, who had since passed away, and despite the growing disrepair, she couldn't bring herself to leave. She still kept the twins' room exactly as it had been that last July. Sheets faded from sunlight, toys lined on the shelf, a pair of muddy sneakers under Eli's bed. Every Sunday, she walked into town, past the shuttered post office and the overgrown playground, to light a candle at St. Jude's. Every Monday, she returned to the woods. She walked the same paths over and over again, wearing down the trails with her footsteps, eyes scanning for anything out of place. A button, a shoe sole, a shred of fabric. Sometimes she brought small toys or poems she'd written, leaving them at the forest's edge like breadcrumbs no one would ever follow. There was no one left in town who told her to stop. They understood that kind of pain doesn't heal. It simply changes its shape. In Grayson Hollow, the twins' case had become something like folklore. Children who hadn't been born yet when Emma and Eli vanished still knew their names. Parents used their story like a cautionary tale, a warning whispered under breath when little ones wandered too far. Remember the Davis twins. But no one dared speak too loudly about it, as if fear alone might call the forest back to life. Rachel's only regular companion was her neighbor Doris, a widow in her 70s who had lived next door since Rachel was a child. Doris brought soup when the snow was thick and helped patch the roof when a storm peeled off shingles. Sometimes they sat on the porch together, saying nothing, watching the treetops sway. Once, after a long silence, Doris had said, "I don't think they're gone, honey. I think they're just somewhere else." Rachel didn't reply, but she squeezed Doris's hand and let herself believe, just for a moment, that somewhere else meant something other than a grave. As the 10th anniversary approached, Rachel found herself sleeping less and dreaming more. She had a recurring vision, the twins standing at the edge of the woods, just out of reach, holding hands. Eli would look over his shoulder and mouth something she couldn't hear, while Emma raised a finger to her lips, signaling silence. Each time she awoke, Rachel felt the tug in her chest grow stronger, as though her heart, knew something her mind could not comprehend. One morning in mid-July, with the dew still clinging to the grass and the sky painted in soft hues of lavender, Rachel rose earlier than usual. She wrapped herself in the same shawl she'd worn the night they disappeared and walked to the woods before the sun had fully broken the horizon. She stood at the clearing just beyond the tree-line, the one the children had called the quiet place. There was nothing special about it on the surface. A few flat stones, the remains of an old tree stump, a worn trail leading deeper in. But Rachel stood there for a long while, hands tucked into her coat pockets, listening. Not for sounds, but for something else, an absence, a presence, something unnamed that clung to the air like mist. She whispered both their names once, gently, Emma, Eli. Then she turned to go home. What she didn't know, what no one could have known, was that just a few hundred yards away, in the dense thicket where lightning had struck the night before, a massive tree had split and toppled. And deep inside its hollow trunk, wrapped in crumbling plastic and decades of silence, something stirred beneath the bark. A child's diary, long forgotten by the world, waiting for the right hands to open it again. The storm had blown in fast. One of those strange summer tempests that come without warning, born of heat and tension and something older, more primal. Thunder cracked across the sky like a whip, and lightning fractured the darkness above Grayson Hollow. Most of the town had gone to bed early that night, lulled by humidity and the scent of rain. Rachel had stayed up, as she often did in July, watching the wind bend the trees outside her window, her thoughts drifting again to the twins. She didn't sleep until near dawn, and when she did, it was the deep, dreamless sleep of the utterly exhausted. The next morning brought silence, the kind that follows a storm like an apology. Fallen branches littered the yard, and puddles shimmered in the gravel driveway. Rachel made her coffee and stepped onto the porch, her eyes drawn instinctively toward the woods. Something felt different, not in the sky, not in the air, but in the tug behind her ribs, the one she'd felt since the day they vanished. It was stronger now, sharper. 2 miles away, high school junior Caleb Morgan was navigating the wet forest trail behind his uncle's property. He was a lanky kid with a quick mind and a quiet demeanor, known in town for his fascination with nature and an old digital camera always slung around his neck. That morning, he'd ventured out early to document the damage from the storm for a summer photo project. The woods, soaked and steaming, smelled of pine and soil. As he moved between trees, something caught his eye. A thick, ancient maple had split clean in two, its top half resting on the forest floor like a broken monument. He stepped closer. The trunk had cracked open where lightning had scored it, revealing a deep hollow within. Curious, Caleb crouched down and peered inside. At first, all he saw was darkness, the kind that lives in the belly of a tree for decades. But then, something pale and crumpled, half buried in bark and rot, caught the edge of his vision. Carefully, he reached in and pulled it free. It was a small parcel, wrapped in what remained of a plastic grocery bag, now brittle and yellowed with time. Inside was a faded, spiral-bound notebook, pink, with the faint outline of cartoon butterflies still visible on the cover. Caleb's breath caught. Written in smudged ink on the inside flap was a name, Emma Davis. He sat down hard, right there in the mud. His heart pounded as he flipped through the pages. Most were covered in the rounded scrawl of a child, some in pencil, others in colored pen. There were drawings, diary entries, little hearts, and stars. One page simply read, "Eli is scared, but I told him I'm not. We'll be brave." Another, "I heard someone in the dark. Not a bear. Not Daddy." Caleb turned to the last legible entry. It was dated July 14th, 2015, the day the twins disappeared. He didn't finish reading. Instead, he stood, notebook in hand, and bolted down the trail toward home. His mother, Marcia Morgan, worked at the Grayson Hollow Public Library and had been Rachel Davis's friend in another life, before everything changed. Caleb burst into the kitchen, hair soaked with sweat and rain, and dropped the diary on the table. "Mom," he gasped, "you need to call Mrs. Davis. Now." Rachel arrived 20 minutes later, her old sedan rattling into the Morgan driveway. She looked tired, older than her 51 years, with silver streaking her once dark hair. Caleb met her at the door, holding the diary as if it might vanish. We placed it in her hands. Rachel didn't speak. She only stared down at the cover, her fingers trembling, tracing the faded lettering as if it were Braille. She sat on their couch, opened to the first page, and began to read. The room fell silent, except for the sound of turning pages and the occasional sharp breath. Caleb and Marcia watched from across the room, unsure whether to interrupt, to speak, or simply to bear witness. Emma's words leapt off the page, innocent, frightened, brave. She wrote about the game of hide and seek, about following Eli into the woods farther than they were supposed to, about a quiet man who had watched them from behind a tree, silent and unmoving. The entries became increasingly erratic toward the end. Short sentences, scribbled drawings of eyes, and references to the door in the ground and the knot place. Rachel's voice finally broke the silence. She was alive for at least 2 days after her hand covered her mouth. She stood abruptly, clutching the diary to her chest. "I need to go." Marcia reached for her, but Rachel was already out the door. She drove straight to the sheriff's office, her foot heavy on the pedal, tears blurring her vision. When she stepped inside and placed the diary on the counter, Deputy Linda Grayson, now the acting sheriff, looked up startled. Rachel simply said, "I think you're going to want to read this." And so, after a decade of silence, the forest finally gave something back. Not closure, not answers, but a whisper, a thread pulled from the dark that might finally begin to unravel the truth. Sheriff Linda Grayson hadn't slept well in years, but the day Rachel Davis walked into her office clutching that diary, something shifted inside her. A bone-deep unease she hadn't felt since the original case broke 10 years earlier. She had been a deputy back then, young and untested, and she remembered standing in the Davis woods beside Sheriff Halford, the grizzled man who'd spent most of that summer with a map in one hand and a megaphone in the other, calling the twins' names until his voice gave out. Halford had retired in 2018, broken by the case he could never close. Linda had carried the weight since. She cleared her desk and laid the diary on a clean pad of paper, slipping on gloves out of habit. Rachel sat across from her, arms crossed tightly, like she was holding herself together by sheer will. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The hum of the air conditioning filled the silence. When Linda finally opened the first page, she felt the air shift, like something sacred had been disturbed. Emma's handwriting was unmistakably that of a child, and the early entries were almost too pure, too normal. Drawings of butterflies, notes about favorite songs, a game she and Eli invented called Leaf Fairies. But as she flipped forward, the innocence gave way to fear. July 13th. We went too far. Eli says he heard someone behind us. I told him it was just a deer, but I don't think so. July 14th, morning. We're hiding in a place with a lot of rocks. It's cold here. My legs hurt. I don't like the quiet man. He doesn't talk, just stands. Later that same day, there's a door. Not like a real door. It's in the ground, but I saw light under it. He opened it and made us go in. I'm scared. By the time Linda reached the final pages, her heart was beating faster than she cared to admit. Emma had described a strange underground room, not a basement, not like our house, more like a hole with walls. She wrote that the man fed them crackers and apple slices, but never spoke. That he smelled like wet dirt and something sharp. The last legible sentence read, "He left the door open." I can hear something else now. Not him. Something deeper. Linda closed the diary and looked up. Rachel's eyes were brimming, her knuckles white against her knees. "We searched that entire forest, Linda," she whispered. "How could we have missed something like that?" The sheriff stood and walked to the evidence room. She pulled out the old Davis file, 4 boxes of maps, photos, search logs, handwritten notes from volunteers and professionals alike. She spread a topographical map across her desk, one so worn at the corners it had begun to curl like old bark. She traced the last known location of the twins, where their trail had ended at the edge of Dry Creek bed, then turned her finger northward toward the cluster of trees where the split maple had fallen just days earlier. We always assumed they went east toward the highway, Linda muttered. But if they double back... Rachel leaned over the map. There's a limestone ridge there. It's riddled with old washouts and sinkholes. My dad used to call them ghost caves. Said he'd played in them as a kid before they were fenced off. Linda frowned. We fenced off parts of a northern ridge after the Carter boy fell in a few years ago. But that whole section was never searched thoroughly. Too unstable. The two women stared at the map in silence. Rachel reached for the diary again, flipping to the page where Emma had drawn a crude sketch of the door in the ground. It looked like a trapdoor with uneven boards and something that resembled a metal latch. She had written in shaky letters underneath, "Don't open unless it's Mom." Linda felt the weight of 10 years pressing down on her shoulders. She straightened up, took a breath, and said, "We're going back in. Today." By noon, 2 deputies, a search dog unit, and Rachel herself stood at the edge of the ridge. The fallen maple marked their path, and as they worked their way through the underbrush, every broken branch and sunken patch of earth felt significant. The forest was louder than usual, buzzing with insects, the air thick with humidity and something else. Anticipation, perhaps, or dread. An hour into the search, the dog handler called out. One of the shepherds had begun pawing frantically at a patch of ivy-covered ground. Beneath the green was a depression in the earth, man-made. As they cleared the brush, something wooden emerged. Old planks, warped and cracked with age. And there it was, just like Emma had drawn it. A latch, rusted with time, embedded in the center of the wooden door. Rachel dropped to her knees, her breath catching. She placed her hand over the latch and whispered, "It's me, baby. It's Mom." The forest stilled. No bird song, no wind, just the sound of wood groaning softly beneath her touch, as if something beneath had finally heard her voice. The latch groaned like a wounded animal when Rachel pulled on it, rust flaking off in her fingers. The wood of the trapdoor was swollen and brittle, but with the help of one of the deputies, they managed to pry it open, revealing a square of darkness that breathed out a smell so strong and ancient it made her stomach lurch. Damp stone, old soil, something faintly metallic. They aimed flashlights down into the hole. A crude ladder, more like wooden slats hammered into the earth, descended about 10 feet before it hit packed dirt. Rachel hesitated, her heart thudding like a second pulse behind her ribs, but then she swung her legs over and began to climb down. No one tried to stop her. The ground beneath was uneven and cool. The beam from her flashlight danced across the interior. A space no wider than a small shed, with stone walls that curved inward like a cellar. Roots twisted along the ceiling, and puddles had formed in the corners from years of seepage. But it wasn't empty. Against the far wall, there was a child-sized mattress, filthy and sunken in the middle. A chipped metal bowl rested beside it, still holding the dry remains of something that might have once been fruit. Next to the mattress, barely visible beneath a layer of old leaves, Rachel's light caught on something small and familiar. A plastic barrette, pale pink, shaped like a daisy. She dropped to her knees, reaching out to pick it up. Her fingers trembled. "Emma's," she whispered. Her voice broke on the name. The air in the underground room was colder than it should have been, not just in temperature, but in memory, in weight. There were drawings scrawled on the stone walls in what looked like charcoal, stick figures, jagged suns, and a strange repeating shape that looked like a keyhole or an eye. Above the mattress, scratched deep into the wall, were the words, "He watches from below." By now, the others had descended. Linda, the deputies, even Caleb's mother, Marcia, who'd come running when the news hit town. They all stood silently, scanning the room, saying nothing. There was something sacred about the space, like a confession no one had asked to hear but couldn't ignore. Rachel spotted a second tunnel, narrower and descending at a sharp angle, like an animal burrow. It was half collapsed, but the entrance remained. Beside it lay an old flashlight, long dead, and a cloth doll missing one button eye. They were down here, Rachel said, more to herself than anyone. They were really down here. Long enough to build a world, Linda murmured, and not a safe one. The team spent hours documenting the space, collecting every scrap of cloth, every smudge on the wall. Forensics was called. A ground-penetrating radar crew was requested from the state office. But nothing could mask the truth already scrawled on the walls. The twins had been alive after their disappearance. Days, maybe longer, and someone had known where they were. That evening, Rachel sat on her porch again, diary in her lap, the pink barrette curled tight in her hand. She didn't speak to anyone, just sat, staring out toward the trees, as the sun sank low and the cicadas hummed. People passed by on foot, in trucks, on bicycles, slowing as they neared her house, not sure whether to offer condolences or curiosity. No one stopped. Inside, Linda pored over the old case files again. There were too many missing pieces, too many assumptions they'd made that now felt paper thin. They'd chased hikers, interviewed delivery drivers, questioned every neighbor and passerby within a 5-mile radius. But they'd never found the one constant, the one set of footprints that didn't belong, the presence that Emma had called the quiet man. That night, Linda received a call from the crime scene team, still on site. "Sheriff," one of the techs said, his voice hushed, almost reverent. "We found something wedged behind the stone wall. It's another notebook. A different one." Her pulse quickened. "It's not Emma's," the voice continued. "It's a man's handwriting. Older. Lots of names. Dates." She drove back in the dark, headlights cutting across the trees like searchlights from a distant past. The tech handed her the notebook with gloved hands. It was water damaged, but mostly intact. Inside were pages of scribbled notes, entries written in a looping, erratic script. "They don't scream after 3 days. They just sleep and hum. The girl sees more than the boy. I think she dreams the way I used to." And then, on a separate page, a list. Names. Some crossed out, others not. And halfway down, underlined twice, were the words, "Emma and Eli Davis." July 14th, 2015. Linda sat down hard on a nearby stump. The forest no longer felt like trees and wind and wildlife. It felt like something else, something watching just out of sight. She flipped to the back of the notebook. One final entry. "They escaped. The girl left me a message. The boy tried to fight. I buried the door, but they knew. I see her in the trees now. I see her watching me. Maybe I'm already gone." Rachel didn't know yet, but tomorrow she would, and it would change everything. Linda arrived at Rachel's house just after dawn. Mist still clung to the fields like a ghost refusing to leave, and the air had that quiet, electric charge of a morning that knows its peace won't last. Rachel stood on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, looking not at Linda, but past her, out toward the edge of the woods where the sun hadn't yet touched the soil. She looked like someone waiting for a train that never came. "I didn't sleep," Rachel murmured as Linda climbed the steps. "I kept hearing whispers. Might have been the wind, but," her voice trailed off, "I think I used to hear them too. Right after they disappeared, I'd lie in bed and swear I heard Emma calling my name from the trees." Linda didn't argue. She'd seen too many strange things in her years on the force to dismiss what a mother claimed to feel, especially a mother like Rachel. Sharp, steady, but cracked where the light never quite reached anymore. She handed over the weather-stained notebook without a word. Rachel took it slowly, flipping through the pages. Her eyes scanned the names, stopping at Emma and Eli's, underlined like a sentence never meant to be spoken aloud. When she got to the back, the final entry, her breath caught. "Who wrote this?" she asked quietly, voice shaking. "We don't know yet," Linda said, "but the state archivist is digging into older local records, landowners, drifters, maybe even folks who used to work the quarry back when it was still open. We're casting a wide net. Whoever he was, he knew the woods better than anyone. He made that space, lived in it, maybe for years." Rachel closed the notebook, pressing it to her chest like it was a prayer. "He watched them," she whispered, "and we never saw him." The news spread through Ash Hollow like fire through dry brush. People began remembering things they hadn't thought of in years. A man with mismatched boots seen walking near the gas station late at night. The stench some claimed came from deep in the quarry on hot days. A shack once spotted by hunters that vanished the next season. An elderly woman named Nora Everett came forward, saying she remembered a man named Leonard Pike who'd lived alone in a trailer deep in the woods during the early 90s. "He was quiet," she said, Did odd jobs. Real odd. Folks said he wasn't right in the head, but he was polite. Disappeared after that big flood in '97. Thought he drowned. A search of property deeds showed no ownership under Pike's name, but a birth certificate surfaced. Leonard Abel Pike, born 1953 in nearby Boone County. No criminal record. No known relatives. One photo from a church directory showed a thin man with sunken eyes and a crooked jaw. He looked like someone who might disappear in a crowd and never be missed. Linda pinned his photo to the board in her office. Next to it, she placed a copy of the diary page Emma had written about the quiet man. The resemblance was eerie, not in the face itself, but in the way the presence came through, wordless, watchful. The sheriff kept coming back to the final words in the man's notebook. I see her in the trees now. It didn't sound like guilt. It sounded like fear. More chilling still was the state forensics report. Fibers from the underground room matched clothing Rachel had provided from Emma's dresser, and tiny, partial prints on the rusted flashlight were confirmed to be a child's, likely Eli's. There was no longer any doubt. The twins had been kept there. But for how long? And how had they escaped? A week passed. Then two. Search teams scoured the nearby caves and collapsed mine shafts for bones, clothing, any sign of second exit. But the forest gave no answers. Just trees, wind, and silence, so deep it felt like breath held forever. Rachel, unable to sleep, began visiting the split maple daily, sitting beside the tree for hours, reading from the diary, sometimes speaking into the wind like her daughter might hear. On the 14th day, she brought 2 paper lanterns and hung them from the low branch, one for Emma, one for Eli. As the sun set, the lanterns began to sway gently, their thin light flickering like echoes of something just beyond reach. And then, as she turned to leave, she saw it. A new carving in the bark of the maple. Fresh, still sticky with sap. A single word, run. Her breath stopped. She touched it, felt the sharp edges, the depth. It hadn't been there yesterday. Someone had done this overnight. Someone who knew the tree, the place, the story. She backed away slowly, the woods suddenly alive around her with shadows and suggestion. Back at the sheriff's office, Linda called in a retired detective from the Pike County case, a man named Clay Redford who remembered Pike well. He wasn't stupid, Clay said. Wrote journals, pages and pages, most of them gibberish. Thought he could hear voices underground. Always digging. Said the earth had tunnels, mouths. That something lived inside him. Linda didn't believe in monsters, but when Rachel showed her the carving, her stomach turned. Whoever left that message wasn't just reliving the past. They were still watching. Still nearby. And somewhere in the tangle of trees and time, the truth wasn't done with them yet. The sun filtered through Ash Hollow in hazy gold, the kind of light that softened everything it touched. Rooftops, weathered fences, the tired lines on the faces of folks who'd lived through too many hard seasons. But beneath the calm of morning, the town stirred with a different kind of energy now. Everyone had heard about the underground room, about the diary, about the name Leonard Pike. And though no one said it out loud, they all felt it deep down. The past wasn't done with them, and the woods hadn't let go. Rachel walked to the market that morning for the first time in weeks. She moved like someone swimming against memory, her eyes searching every face for something she couldn't name. People watched her, some with pity, some with guilt, a few with that distant unease reserved for things too big to understand. Mrs. Connolly, the baker, offered her a warm loaf and whispered, "God bless you, dear," while slipping a note into her hand. Rachel waited until she was halfway down the street before opening it. In shaky cursive, it read, "He used to buy bread here. Always asked for 2. 1 white, 1 rye. He said they were for his guests." She folded the note slowly, heart thudding. Pike had been among them. Invisible, unnoticed, blending in like moss on a stone. And nobody had asked why a man with no family, no job, and no address would buy food for children no one ever saw. That afternoon, Linda called an emergency town meeting at the community center. It had been years since the place was this full. Every pew taken, every wall leaned against. Retired folks, factory workers, school teachers, old friends of the Davis family. No one spoke much until Linda stepped forward, notebook in hand, and exhaustion painted across her face. "I know many of you are scared," she said, her voice steady but low. "I know this town has carried a wound for 10 years, and reopening it feels like letting something terrible crawl out again. But we don't have the full truth. Not yet. And we need to face the fact that someone, maybe more than one person, knew something back then and said nothing." A rustle moved through the crowd. People shifted, cleared their throats, avoided each other's eyes. Finally, an old man in the back stood up. Paul Granger, who ran the town's hardware store for nearly 4 decades. "I remember that fella," he said, nodding slowly. "Pike. He came in sometimes late at night, right before close. Never bought much. Rope once. A handsaw. Bleach. I figured he was just another loner trying to fix up something rotten." "Did you report it?" Linda asked gently. Paul shook his head. "Didn't think much of it then. Ash Hollow's had its share of strange folks." One by one, others began speaking up. A girl who'd seen a man crouched near the edge of the playground the day before Emma and Eli vanished. A logger who remembered a strange smoke coming from the woods, thick and bitter. A former mail carrier who once delivered a package addressed only with the words for the quiet ones. All these pieces scattered across a decade, like bones buried too deep to see until now. Rachel sat in the front row, clutching Emma's barrette in her hand like it could anchor her to this moment. Every new detail was a blow and a balm, confirming the twins had been close, right there within the town's heartbeat, and that they'd been missed not because they vanished, but because no one looked deeply enough. Then came a voice no one expected. Marcia Ellison, Caleb's mother, stood near the side door, pale and trembling. "My son," she said, her voice quivering. "He used to play in those woods too. Said he had a hiding place no one could find. Said there was a man who gave him riddles." She stopped, staring down at her hands. "I thought it was a game. Kids have imaginations. But now I'm not so sure." Linda walked to her. "What kind of riddles?" Marcia shook her head. "He never told me. Just said they were strange. He wrote some in a notebook. I threw it out years ago. Thought it was nonsense." The room had fallen completely silent now. Not even a cough or whisper broke through. Linda turned back to the crowd. "If anyone else remembers something, anything, no matter how small or strange, now's the time." Rachel stepped forward then. "He carved into the tree again," she said softly. "The one where the diary was hidden. Yesterday." The word was run. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. It was clear now. Someone was still out there. Maybe a copycat. Maybe someone connected to Pike. Maybe even Pike himself, if he wasn't already buried under the weight of time and guilt. That night, Linda and Rachel sat together on the sheriff's porch, the air thick with crickets and heat lightning in the distance. "Do you think we're getting close?" Rachel asked. Linda nodded. "Close enough that the truth's starting to sweat." And from the shadows, just beyond the porch light's reach, something watched. Not the wind, not an animal, something that remembered what the town forgot. The next morning broke with a sky so thick and gray it looked as though it had forgotten how to let the sun through. Rain threatened on the horizon, but didn't come. Ash Hollow was suspended in a stillness that felt like waiting. Sheriff Linda Carver sat at her desk, surrounded by old case files, crime scene photographs, and stacks of hand-typed reports that had once led nowhere. But today, for the first time in 10 years, the evidence was beginning to speak. She opened the thin folder marked with Caleb Ellison's name. It was a missing child report filed in the spring of 2007, 4 years before the twins disappeared. Caleb had vanished for 3 days and then returned, dazed, confused, claiming he had fallen into a ravine and survived on berries and rainwater. His story had never quite made sense, but the town had been too relieved to question it too hard. He was 6 at the time. Too young, they'd said, to lie like that. Too innocent to spin a tale. But now Linda wasn't so sure. She drove to the Ellison house, a tidy bungalow with peeling shutters and a swing that hadn't moved in years. Marcia answered the door in her robe, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. "He's still asleep," she said. "Hasn't been himself since the meeting. Keeps saying he remembers more, but the details won't stay." Linda waited in the living room while Marcia gently woke her son. Caleb emerged slowly, his frame tall now, but his steps unsure, like a man still walking inside a dream. He sat across from Linda, clutching a mug of tea, eyes not meeting hers. "Caleb," she said softly, "I want you to think back to the place you used to go in the woods. The man with the riddles. Can you tell me anything about him?" He was silent for a long time. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, "He had a limp and a scar on his jaw. I used to think it was from a bear, but he said it was a punishment from the earth." His eyes flickered. He'd say strange things, that the woods were alive and that they'd choose who got to stay. Linda leaned forward. "Did you ever go underground with him?" Caleb nodded slowly. "There was a hole, a wooden hatch covered in leaves. He told me not to touch it unless he said so. But one day I did, and I saw toys, a blanket, little drawings on the wall, names." His voice cracked. "One of them was Emma." Linda's pulse kicked hard at her throat. "Why didn't you say anything then?" "I tried," he said. "I told my mom. But then I got sick, real sick, high fever, night terrors. And after I got better, I couldn't remember where it was. I thought maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was part of the dream." Marcia sat in the doorway, her hands shaking. "He had nightmares for years. I thought it was trauma from getting lost. I never thought." Linda stood. "I think you found the same place where the twins were kept. But something or someone chased you off." By that afternoon, a team of searchers, including state police and canine units, returned to the forest with Caleb guiding them. He couldn't remember exactly where the hatch had been, but he pointed out landmarks: an old tree stump, a rock shaped like a boot, a ridge that smelled like wet leaves and copper. It took hours. Just as they were about to call it, one of the dogs barked sharply near a grove of sumac. Beneath a patch of soft ground, they uncovered remnants of a wooden hatch, nearly rotted through. The hinges were rusted, the boards buckled, but when they pried it open, the smell was unmistakable: mold, rust, and something older. Something that hadn't seen sunlight in years. The underground room was small, no more than 6 feet by 8, and damp. The walls were reinforced with beams taken from old furniture. In one corner sat a decayed mattress. On the wall, barely visible under layers of grime, were names scratched in with what looked like a nail. Emma, Eli, Caleb, and a fourth, Noah. Linda felt the air tighten. "Noah," she whispered. None of the names in the case files matched that. No one in Ash Hollow had reported a missing Noah. Not recently. Not then. They bagged and tagged everything: fabric scraps, a rusted tin cup, crayon stubs, even a half-burned candle. Every piece was a breadcrumb. Every mark was a voice calling back from a decade-long silence. Rachel arrived just as the last evidence bag was sealed. She stood over the hole, arms crossed against the cold, rain finally beginning to mist the ground. "So they were really here," she said, not asking. Linda nodded. "And someone else. Maybe more than one." Rachel stared down into the earth. "I can't stop thinking," she said, "about how many days they spent in the dark. What they dreamed about. If they ever stopped hoping someone was coming." The rain thickened, running down their faces, their clothes, the trees. It soaked the town slowly, as though trying to wash something long embedded from the ground itself. But some things don't wash away. They only rise. That evening, after the site had been cleared and the evidence secured, Rachel sat in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by the ghosts of old toys, faded wallpaper, and memories that had turned brittle with time. She clutched Emma's barrette in one hand and the diary in the other, flipping back to the page where the word "run" had been etched so faintly it was almost lost to the grain. The entries no longer read like ramblings. They pulsed with meaning, with warnings, and with pieces of a world only Emma and Eli had known. The handwriting grew more erratic toward the final pages, like the hand that wrote them had started to tremble. "I can hear him above us," one line read. "He hums when he's angry. I think he smells the fear." Another scrawled confession: "Eli says we should leave through the tunnel, but it's dark, and I'm scared it's not just rats down there." Rachel blinked hard against the rising pressure behind her eyes. Each word was her daughter speaking across a canyon of time. Each sentence was a cry she hadn't heard. Downstairs, Sheriff Linda was piecing together the caseboard, stringing yarn between photographs and locations, trying to understand the movements of a man who'd slipped through the cracks for too long. They now had evidence linking Leonard Pike to the underground chamber, but it wasn't just him anymore. The name Noah carved into the wall had cracked the foundation of the story, and every line in Emma's diary suggested more than one captor, or perhaps a network, an arrangement. Something larger than they had feared. Linda rubbed her eyes and opened the thin envelope that had been dropped anonymously at the station that morning. No return address. Inside was a black and white photo, worn at the edges, of 5 children sitting on a blanket in a clearing that looked eerily familiar. The twins were unmistakably in the center, holding hands. On either side were 3 other children, all looking at the camera with hollow stares. On the back, in red ink, it said, "Only the quiet ones survive." She stared at the message, hands cold despite the late summer heat. Someone had taken this photo. Someone had watched them. And someone perhaps still was. The next day, a forensic team returned to the woods, this time bringing ground-penetrating radar. They scanned the surrounding area of the hatch, sweeping in tight, overlapping grids. Around midday, they found another anomaly, 6 feet underground, 20 yards west of the first chamber. They dug carefully, slowly, until the edge of a metal box appeared. It was rusted shut and buried in compacted soil. Inside were items preserved against time. A child's jacket, a stuffed rabbit, a cassette tape wrapped in wax paper, and several photographs. The rabbit's name tag read Noah. Rachel was called immediately and arrived breathless, her hands shaking as she reached for the photos. They showed the same group of children from before, now in different settings. In a basement with newspaper-covered windows, crouched beside a lantern, one picture of them all sleeping side by side like puppies in a kennel. The tape was rushed to a lab. When it was cleaned and played, the room fell still. A child's voice echoed through the speaker, frightened, whispering, "If you find this, please tell Mama we didn't run away. We were taken. He said he'd find us again if we ever left. He says the hollow belongs to him." Rachel dropped to her knees, her sobs filling the room as the words played on repeat. For 10 years, she had imagined every possible fate, every version of the end. But none of them had included her daughter, leaving behind a final message that was so clear, so desperate. Linda knelt beside her. This changes everything," she said softly. "This wasn't just one broken man. This was planned, controlled, maybe even watched over by others." Rachel looked up, eyes fierce beneath the tears. "Then we find them. All of them. Because I swear to you, they will not stay hidden again." Back in the forest, as the light began to thin through the trees, a ranger flagged down the sheriff's deputy. "Ma'am," he said, voice tight with confusion, "we found something else." He led her a little further north, to a spot with stones arranged in a pattern. Not random, but deliberate. At the center was a single white feather and a leather-bound book, its cover warped from damp but intact. Linda picked it up with gloved hands and opened the first page. It was a journal, but not Emma's. This one belonged to someone else. Someone named Noah. Sheriff Linda Carver sat alone in the evidence room, the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead the only sound. The leather-bound book, now cataloged as item hashtag 246C, lay open before her, its pages surprisingly legible despite years of exposure. The handwriting was different from Emma's, smaller, tighter, written in the way someone does when they're afraid someone else might be watching. Each entry bore a date, though the year was never specified, and the language was older, more restrained, as though Noah had grown up with books rather than television. She read slowly, absorbing every detail, letting the words settle into the silence. Day 3. The man says I should call him Uncle Red. He doesn't act like an uncle. He watches us when we sleep. He tells stories about the forest, about the ones who live underneath. Emma cried again today. I gave her my blanket. I think she's younger than me. She talks about her brother a lot. I haven't told her yet that I had a brother once too. Linda's fingers hovered above the page. Noah's voice was quiet but observant, as if he'd taken on the burden of recording truth when no one else would. She flipped forward a few pages. Day 11. He brought another one. A boy this time. Caleb. He's scared but tries not to show it. He listens to everything Uncle Red says. I don't trust him yet. Eli doesn't either. We've started marking time by the stories. Every night, he tells one. Every story has a warning. One was about a girl who tried to run. He said she turned into a tree. We laughed, but not too loud. Laughing makes him angry. The implications crawled under Linda's skin. Caleb had indeed been there, and the twins too. But the story went even deeper than that. She read on, the pages turning more fevered, more fractured. Day 19, there's a tunnel. I followed it once while everyone slept. It goes far too far. I heard voices. Not the others. Not the man. Different voices. They whisper my name, even though I never told them. I don't think I want to go back there. Day 22. Emma drew a picture of the sky today. I'd forgotten what blue looked like. She says when she gets out, she wants to live somewhere with no trees. I said I'd go with her. She smiled. That was the first time I saw her smile. Tears welled behind Linda's eyes. These weren't just victims. They were children dreaming of rescue, of freedom, of a world that made sense. And somehow, despite the horror, they had found ways to comfort each other, to share what little light they had. She flipped to the final page, her heart pounding. Day 28. Eli says it's time. We've waited long enough. The tunnel might be the only way. I told Emma to be ready. Caleb says he's too scared, but we said we'd wait for him at the clearing. I'm leaving this journal behind in case something happens. In case I don't come back. If anyone finds this. The entry ended mid-sentence. The pen had dragged across the page, the ink trailing off into a faint smudge. No signature. No goodbye. Linda closed the journal and leaned back in her chair. So many questions surged through her mind. Had Noah made it out? If so, where had he gone? Was he the one who left the photographs? Was he still watching from the shadows? Or had he been silenced like the others? She brought the journal to Rachel that evening. They sat on the porch of Rachel's house, the air thick with the scent of pine and the sounds of crickets calling in the dusk. Rachel turned each page with reverent care, her breath catching at the mention of Emma's smile, her hands trembling when she reached the end. He loved her, she whispered. This boy, Noah, he protected her. Linda nodded. He might have saved her life. Maybe all of them. Rachel stared out into the darkening trees. Then we owe him. We owe all of them. We have to finish this. The next morning, they organized a community meeting at the church hall. This time, people came not out of obligation, but out of urgency. Faces once tight with skepticism were now etched with concern. When Linda read excerpts from Noah's journal, the room was silent, every breath held. And when she mentioned that the tunnel mentioned might still exist, murmurs rippled through the pews. Rachel stood beside her, holding the diary. This isn't just about my children anymore, or Caleb, or even Noah. This is about the silence that let this happen. It's about the forest we all thought we knew, and the monsters we thought were just stories. That night, teams were formed. Search parties organized. Equipment gathered. The town, for the first time in a decade, stood united not in grief, but in purpose. And far out in the woods, under the dense canopy of trees, a crow took flight from a low branch near an old, half-buried stone well, its wings beating once, then twice, as if in warning. The forest had always held its secrets in silence, but now, under the growing weight of years-old sorrow and the rising chorus of resolve, it began to speak. On the third day of the renewed search, one of the volunteers, an older man named Hank Wallace, who had once logged these woods before the county restricted access, paused near a moss-covered stone outcropping not marked on any modern maps. He knelt down, brushed aside decades of leaf litter and pine needles, and uncovered what looked like the rim of a forgotten well. Sheriff Linda was called immediately, and within an hour the area was cordoned off, lights brought in, and excavation began. The soil around the stone ring was soft, loamy with decay. They worked slowly, with reverent hands, until the full circle of the old structure revealed itself. A narrow vertical shaft reinforced with rotting wooden planks and thick iron nails. A heavy, rusted grate lay just beneath the surface, padlocked long ago but now crumbling under the weight of time and moisture. When the grate was removed and the stale air from below rose up to meet them, it carried with it the unmistakable scent of mold, old iron, and something far older, something forgotten. They lowered a small drone first, fitted with a flashlight and camera. The feed flickered for a moment before stabilizing. What they saw sent a chill through every spine gathered there. The tunnel was no natural formation. Stone walls curved inward into an arched corridor, reinforced with ancient brickwork, almost as if it had been part of a much older structure repurposed over the decades. Wooden beams lined the ceiling, supporting its crumbling weight, and along the floor ran a shallow gutter filled with stagnant water. The walls bore strange markings, not writing exactly, but etched shapes and symbols, some childlike, others deeply unsettling in their precision. Sheriff Linda and Rachel stood shoulder to shoulder, staring at the screen, the flickering drone light panning slowly through the forgotten corridor. "This isn't just some cellar," Linda murmured. "This was built deliberately, and it's much older than we thought." Rachel said nothing, only clenched her jaw and nodded once. She knew, in her bones, that Emma and Eli had been down there. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't the only ones. The following morning, a specialized team equipped with breathing masks and reinforced gear entered the tunnel. Rachel insisted on going too. At first, Linda refused, but Rachel's determination proved impenetrable. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She had become the torchbearer for every family that had been swallowed by that forest and left in the dark. They descended in silence, flashlights cutting through the gloom. The air grew colder the deeper they went, the walls slick with condensation and moss. After about 30 feet, they came upon the first chamber, small, circular, lined with makeshift beds fashioned from hay and torn blankets. Children's names were scratched into the stone: Emma, Eli, Noah, Caleb. A few were unfamiliar: Ruth, Daniel, Ivy. Rachel's breath caught. She ran her fingers over each name, tears forming but not falling. She would not cry, not yet. They continued, passing through low archways and narrow corridors. At one point, they found a rusted bell fixed to the wall with a sign above it: "Ring only when it's safe." Its cord had long since rotted away. Another room revealed a chalkboard with drawings, stick figures under trees, a house with no windows, and what looked like a large eye, open wide, staring at them from the center of the board. Finally, they reached a steel door sealed tight with a rusted lever. It took 2 men to break it open. Beyond it lay a room unlike the others, larger, cleaner, almost sterile. Shelves lined the walls, filled with labeled jars, tapes, and folders. A desk stood in the center, with an old cassette recorder and a stack of labeled cassettes beside it. One was marked simply, Session 5, Eli. They played the tape right there, in the cold silence of that room. The hiss of static gave way to a boy's voice, frightened, tired. "My name is Eli Monroe. I'm 9 years old. The man says if I talk, I get food. He says if I don't, Emma gets punished. I don't want her to get hurt. Please, if anyone hears this." The tape cut abruptly. Rachel fell to her knees, her whole body shaking. She could hear her son's voice in the stale air, 10 years too late to hold him, but not too late to remember every word, every syllable. Sheriff Linda knelt beside her. "This place," she said, voice grim, "wasn't just a prison. It was a laboratory, a theater, maybe worse." Rachel stood slowly, brushing dirt from her jeans. "Then let's burn it to the ground when we're done." But as they turned to leave, one of the techs called out. He'd found something else, beneath the desk, tucked into a crevice behind the wall. A small, torn notebook, child-sized. The first page was signed, in careful script, Ruth Eberly, age 10, still alive. Rachel held the diary as though it might crumble in her hands, its cover cracked and soft from time, the corners darkened with the oils of small fingers and years underground. The handwriting inside was small but steady, with each letter formed in a child's earnest attempt at clarity. The name on the first page, Ruth Eberly, brought with it a hush, as if even the damp walls leaned in to listen. Sheriff Linda knelt beside her, flashlight steady over Rachel's shoulder. "That name," she said, voice low, "it's in our missing children reports. Ruth disappeared in 2014. Pennsylvania. Her family was camping near Allegheny." Rachel flipped the page, her heart thudding in her chest. The entries were dated, surprisingly consistent, and even included rough drawings in the margins of trees, faces, stars, and sometimes a single eye with lashes drawn like spikes. She began to read aloud, though her voice wavered with each word. "Day 45, Eli helped me sneak extra crackers. He said not to tell. Emma's still coughing. Mr. H says it's adjustment sickness. I think he's lying." Caleb drew on the wall again and got no dinner. The pages became more fragmented the further they read. Sometimes entries were missing for days, and when they resumed, the handwriting was shakier. The children were kept underground, that much was clear. Mr. H, a name that appeared again and again, seemed to control their daily routines, offering rewards and punishments based on obedience, silence, and participation in what Ruth began to call the program. Rachel paused on one page where Ruth had scrawled, in larger, shakier letters, "The ones who forget go upstairs. We never see them again." A drawing followed, stick figures with XS for eyes, one hand raised as if waving goodbye. Her breath caught, and for a moment the diary felt heavier than stone. Further in, the entries grew more desperate. Ruth wrote of Eli crying at night, of Emma growing weaker, her hands shaking, her voice thin. There were days when food didn't come, days when the lights stayed on too long, days when Mr. H's voice echoed through the tunnels, distorted by old speakers, demanding games, tests, and stories told in the dark. But it was one entry near the back that made Rachel fall still. Day 131. He said, "Eli's going to the room. He told me not to cry, but I saw Eli smile when he left. He whispered that he had a plan. I hope he meant it. I hope he saves Emma." The page was stained, water or maybe tears, and the ink had bled, but the meaning was clear. Eli had planned something. Even then, after weeks, maybe months underground, he'd clung to something deeper than fear. Rachel pressed her hand over the words and closed her eyes. Linda stood slowly, looking around the room. "We need to clear the rest of this place. And we need that name out there, Ruth Eberly. If she survived, there might be others." By sunset, the entire area had been declared a crime scene. Federal investigators arrived the next morning, along with cadaver dogs and forensic experts. They scoured every inch of the hidden complex, uncovering more names, more signs of life and loss. Scraps of clothing, faded photographs, a broken recorder with a final tape, never played, labeled simply, Emma. But even as the official process unfolded around her, Rachel remained focused on the diary. She read every page, sometimes through tears, sometimes aloud for the others. Ruth had drawn a map near the back, crude but recognizable. A section labeled Outside Room, with an arrow leading past the corridor they had entered through. Another tunnel, still unexplored, hidden behind a shelving unit now half collapsed. That same evening, the team cleared it. Behind rotted wood and moldy tarps, they found a second passage, narrower, steeper. At the end, 30 paces in, they found what remained of a bolt-locked iron hatch. And beyond it, a chamber filled with remnants of escape. A torn blanket used as rope, one small boot, and a panel in the wall removed to reveal exposed roots and soil. A tunnel dug by hand. Rachel knelt there, fingers grazing the blanket. "He tried to get out," she whispered. "He was getting her out." It took hours to excavate the tunnel safely, and in the early morning light, they emerged into the clearing not far from where the diary had first been found. The tunnel had led them full circle to the tree, to the hiding place only a desperate child might have remembered. Rachel looked around the clearing and finally understood. The tree hadn't been just a secret spot. It had been a message, a marker left for someone, anyone, who might come looking, a promise buried in bark and dirt. We were here. We tried, and someone, somehow, had survived. By the time the sun pushed over the treetops and bathed the clearing in gold, The silence of the morning was anything but peaceful. Investigators murmured to one another in clipped voices. Cameras clicked, and evidence bags crinkled as the underground chamber gave up more of its secrets. But amid the bustle, Rachel sat alone on a rock beside the tree, diary still in hand, knees drawn up, as if the weight of what she'd read had settled somewhere deep inside her bones. She kept returning to the final entries, the way Ruth had written less like a child and more like a girl shouldering something far too big for her young heart. There was bravery there, bravery shaped like faith, like hope. She thought of Eli, the way he'd whispered about a plan, the way he'd smiled, not with ignorance but intent. It wasn't hard to imagine him promising his sister that they'd escape. Rachel wondered if that escape had happened. And if it had, why hadn't they come back? Inside the command tent, Sheriff Linda stood with 2 federal agents and a map pinned to a corkboard. There were dots marking each tunnel segment, photographs taped beside child-sized footprints, and post-it notes listing names, some real, some just fragments from memory. 4 confirmed children from old missing persons reports, she said. Ruth Eberly, Caleb Neely, Emma Porter, and Elijah Eli Graves. The twins, Eli and Emma, vanished from Maine in July 2013. Ruth disappeared from Pennsylvania the following spring. Caleb from Iowa that winter. All within a 13-month window. All during family outings. The agents exchanged glances. One scribbled something in a notebook. So we're dealing with an interstate predator, one who transported minors across state lines and maintained an underground facility long-term. This was more than abduction. This was a system, a project. Rachel stepped into the tent, her voice low but urgent. Ruth wrote about others, about the ones who went upstairs. We haven't found their names yet, but they were here too. And if Eli dug that tunnel, if he got him out, then someone made it. We need to find out who. That afternoon, Linda brought Rachel to the sheriff's office to review archive case files. The 2 women sat at a wide oak desk, surrounded by boxes stacked to the ceiling, each one filled with laminated photos, faded notes, newspaper clippings, and scribbled call logs. It was old-school detective work, sifting, comparing, cross-checking timelines. Then it happened. Rachel pulled a file marked unidentified, 2015, and opened it to a weathered photograph of a young girl, roughly 10 years old, found wandering alone on a rural road near Asheville, North Carolina. No name, no memory, malnourished. She'd refused to speak for weeks, eventually placed in foster care, and by the time she began to talk, she claimed to remember nothing about where she'd come from, only nightmares about tunnels, lights, and a man who spoke through walls. The photo was blurry, but Rachel knew that face. Her breath caught as she ran to the evidence board. The shape of the chin, the curve of the eyes. She pulled a drawing Ruth had made in the diary, one labeled Emma with braids. It matched. She's alive, Rachel whispered. She's been here all along. They traced her through the system, found her name, given by the foster family, Sarah Lane. Now 17, still living in the state. Enrolled in high school, top marks in English, known for being quiet but kind. Note the disciplinary record. A girl who had learned to survive by forgetting. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She lay awake thinking about the courage it must have taken to crawl through that dirt tunnel with no light, dragging a younger sibling behind her, not knowing if she'd ever see daylight again. Eli must have made her go first, she realized. He must have pushed her through, stayed behind to buy her time. That's why she never came back. That's why no one else did. He sacrificed himself. The next morning, Linda made the call. The authorities arranged a careful meeting with Sarah and her adoptive parents. When they showed Ruth's diary, the girl turned pale. When they spoke the names, Eli, Emma, Caleb, her lip trembled. But it wasn't until Rachel placed the drawing in her lap that something finally cracked. A whisper, barely a breath. I didn't mean to leave him. Tears followed. Then stories. Then names. Her name was Emma Graves. She remembered the tunnel. She remembered Eli holding her hand in the dark, telling her to run. She remembered his voice calling out behind her, but she had kept going because he'd begged her to. She'd run until her legs gave out, crawled through briars, and collapsed on a back road where a trucker eventually found her. And over the years, the memories had become shadows, easier to forget than to carry. But now the past had found her, and it had brought something she never expected, someone who had never stopped searching. The small room where they gathered to hear Emma's story was quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the steady scratch of a pen on notebook paper. Rachel sat beside her, holding her hand gently, feeling the tremor beneath the surface, the raw, trembling courage it took to face a past buried so deeply. Emma's voice was barely above a whisper at first, but with each sentence, it grew stronger, fuller, as if reclaiming herself one word at a time. She told them about the days underground, the chilling quiet that swallowed years, the endless games forced upon them by Mr. H, and the small moments of hope, the stolen smiles, the whispered promises, and Eli's unyielding determination. She spoke of how she had carried the diary, not knowing if anyone would ever find it, but believing that someday someone would come. That faith had been her lifeline. Rachel's eyes filled with tears as Emma recounted the moment she finally escaped. The crushing fear, the desperate crawl through earth and roots, the taste of freedom, and the unbearable grief for the brother she left behind. Yet, beneath the sorrow, there was a fierce light, a promise not just to survive, but to heal and to help others lost in the shadows. In the weeks that followed, the community rallied around Emma. News outlets covered the story with reverence and care, highlighting the courage of a girl who had been lost, but never forgotten. Support groups formed for families of missing children, and initiatives were launched to strengthen protections and prevent tragedies like this. Emma became a symbol, not just of survival, but of hope renewed. Rachel and Linda worked tirelessly to trace the remaining tunnels and identify others who might have been held captive. Each discovery brought new pain, but also the possibility of closure. And while the search for Eli and the others continued, Emma's presence was a beacon, a reminder that even in the darkest places, light could find its way through. One crisp autumn afternoon, Rachel visited the clearing once more, the old tree standing tall against the blue sky. She placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at its base, feeling the weight of years lifted just a little. It was a place of memory and promise, a testament to resilience and love. And as the wind rustled the leaves overhead, she whispered a quiet thank you to the children who had dared to hope, who had fought to be seen, and who had, in the end, found their way home. The story of the twins and the diary was not just one of loss, but of the unbreakable bonds that tie us all, across time, distance, and silence. It was a story that would live on in hearts and minds, a gentle but powerful reminder that no one is truly forgotten as long as someone remembers. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through a story of hope, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of family. If this tale touched your heart or made you think, please consider subscribing to the channel for more stories that move and inspire. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts or your own stories in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Your support means the world and helps keep these stories alive. Until next time, take care and remember, no one is ever truly forgotten when we keep their memory alive together.